Morning everyone. Well, firstly, I just sound delighted to be talking here at Scribefest today. My name, as John said, my name is Alex Saunders. I'm a partner in a firm called Leathes Prior who are based in Norwich, in the Cathedral Close in Norwich. And for my sins, amongst other things, I specialise in data protection. So please don't judge me too much on that. I do other things, but one of the things I do is data protection. And what I'm going to be talking to you today about is the GDPR and 5 common myths. And we'll be looking to debunk those myths as much as possible. So, whilst the GDPR has been around now for getting on for 3.5 years, there is still a huge amount of confusion and misinformation that's out there. And what I'm hoping to do for you today is to navigate through some of that confusion and give you a clear and hopefully pragmatic guide as to what you can and can't do. So the GDPR, I mean, who remembers that? It feels like a lot has happened since, but it's certainly something that's still relevant. And if you cast your minds back to 2018, when the GDPR first came into force, it was, it really was the hot topic of the time. I remember my local newspaper running with the headline, "Is GDPR bigger than Brexit?" And whilst in today's world that seems absolutely ludicrous, at the time it gives you a bit of a flavour as to just how hyped the legislation was, and to an extent what sort of scaremongering there was. So in view of that, there is a lot of misinformation, and I'm going to be looking to dispel and clarify that as much as I possibly can. So, GDPR. Unless you've been living under a rock for the last 3.5 years, you'll have probably at least heard the term. So I'm just going to give a very brief intro. When I'm talking about the UK GDPR, which you'll see on the slides, that is the correct version. All it means, it's exactly the same thing, it's just the same as the GDPR, same legislation, just the UK version. Came into force, as I mentioned, on the 25th of May 2018. Most importantly, it governs the use of personal data. So when I'm talking about personal data, I'm talking about anything that identifies an individual. So that could be a name, an email address, a telephone number, even an IP address is personal data. But company information, so anything about a corporate body, isn't. And sort of what might be relevant for some of you at the conference today is that, and rather morbidly for a Wednesday, information relating to the deceased actually isn't applicable. So if you're administering things like cemeteries, for example, if you've got records relating to that, that falls outside of the scope of the GDPR. It applies to all organisations in the UK and those non-UK organisations that are offering goods and services in the UK, so it's going to be applicable to pretty much everyone, I suspect, at the conference. And it's enforced in the UK by the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, who sort of have taken initially the role of pantomime villain in a lot of this, but actually are now trying to position themselves as a force for sort of positive change, which remains to be seen. And as for Brexit, one of the many things that's happened or at least been implemented since 2018. I often get clients come to me and say, "Alex, does Brexit mean that GDPR is no longer applicable?" At which point I would love to say, "Yeah, let's just all crack on with our days," but in actual fact, Brexit's made no difference. The GDPR still applies, it's just been incorporated into UK law. But watch this space. There are increasing murmurs that the UK government want to move away from the GDPR. So whilst I think in the short to medium term it's going to be around, there is a possibility that in the longer term we might move away to something slightly less onerous. So, let's get into a bit of myth busting. So the first myth is that consent is always necessary, that you need to get permission in every scenario where you're collecting or using someone's personal information. And as you'll start to see a bit of a pattern with this talk. That's not true. Very much a myth, very much a piece of misinformation. In actual fact, consent is only one way to comply with the GDPR, and that there are lots and lots of other ways to comply, and in many ways consent is sort of one of the less favourable ways to use personal information. So as my first take-home message, you don't always need to get consent, you don't always need to get permission in order to use and collect personal information. So as you can see there, consent is one of 6 lawful basis on which you can use personal information. when you're using personal information, you always need to go back to one of these 6 grounds, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. Consent is one of them, but there are 5 others. And the reason that I sort of say that the GDPR and consent under the GDPR isn't particularly favourable is because it's a very high standard. It needs to be informed, it needs to be specific, it needs to be unambiguous, it needs to be freely given, and it needs to be given by some kind of positive step. So there are lots and lots of boxes that need to be ticked as part of that. And the most important one is that this point around kind of being freely given, that consent means, kind of genuinely does mean having real choice and control. And what I mean by that in practice is, for example, you can't get consent where there's an imbalance of, or it's difficult to get consent where there's an imbalance of bargaining power. So, for example, it's difficult to get consent from employees because those employees aren't really able to say no, or if they do, they might suffer some kind of, some kind of unfavourable treatment. So that makes it more difficult. Also, you can't bundle in consent with other things. So when we're instructed at Leathes Prior, a client will enter into an engagement letter and we'll say, right, we're doing X, Y, and Z for you. What we can't say within that engagement letter is, oh, and by the way, we're going to add you to our marketing list and we're going to be, sending you emails every day. So it's not, you can't bundle those two things together because obviously you can't separate out the service from the marketing, and therefore you can't freely give consent. So consent is really only appropriate where other grounds don't apply, and you're not going to be, in 95% of cases, you're not going to be wanting to get permission to use personal information. As we'll see shortly, you'll have other grounds on which to use that personal information. And the one final thing worth mentioning is that consent can be withdrawn at any time. So if someone gives their consent, they can take it away just as easily. So it doesn't give you any sort of indefinite or long-standing ability to use that person's personal information. And in a recently coined phrase, if someone withdraws their consent, you have no authority to use that personal information. So let's talk about what some of the other grounds are in order for you to use personal information, and probably the ones you're going to be relying on in practice. So firstly, if you've got a contract with an individual and you need to use personal information under that contract, then you're entitled to do so without consent. Easy. So a good example of this would be an employment contract. If you've got employees and you need to pay them, you need to carry out performance reviews, you need to speak to them on a day-to-day basis, then you don't have to get consent. You can just rely on the contract that you have with them. And obviously, it's going to be very difficult to rely on consent in that scenario anyway. This one's going to be really relevant for local councillors. If you're carrying out some kind of public task that's laid down by law, or if you are doing something in the public interest, then you can rely on a specific ground, which is that you're carrying out that using the personal information is necessary to carry out a public task. So that one's going to be, I suspect, in sort of 80–90% of the occasions you're using personal information, that's going to be the relevant one. And then finally, you've got this concept of legitimate interests, which you may have heard of before. So where you are, where you can't sort of peg your use of personal information to any other ground that we've talked about, then you can potentially rely on having a legitimate interest. And what ultimately a legitimate interest means is that you have a genuine reason to use that information, and that the privacy impact on the individual affected is not going to be doesn't override your own legitimate interest. So to give you an example of that, CCTV cameras are a really good example of where you'd rely on a legitimate interest. You've got a legitimate interest, which is the health and safety of people, and also the safety of property as well. And clearly there's not going to be any other ground that's going to be appropriate. You're not going to have someone walking around with a clipboard, getting someone's consent every time, ticking off names. You're not necessarily going to have a contract with those individuals. For example, if it's in a car park, you might just have random people wandering on. It's not necessary for carrying out a public task. So you're probably going to be looking at having a legitimate interest. Against that, if you were to put CCTV cameras in an area that's obviously meant to be private, your legitimate interest is probably going to be overridden by that person's privacy impact. So if you start putting cameras in toilets or other areas that are obviously intended to be private, then clearly the privacy impact on the individual is going to override your own legitimate interest. And just for the record, I definitely don't recommend putting cameras in toilets. So, second myth is around data breaches. So again, there's loads and loads of confusion around this and what you need to do, what a data breach is. So I'm going to try and clear that up in a sort of simpler way as possible, because all organisations will come across data breaches from time to time. So the myth is that all breaches need to be reported in every single instance. And it probably won't surprise you when I say that that is not true. A data breach only needs to be reported where there is risk to the individual involved. So there's no risk to the individual whose data has been breached, then you don't need to report it. So if we just quickly pause there and talk about what a data breach actually is. Well, it's effectively any unlawful or wrong or misuse of someone's personal information. It can be anything from a large-scale hack that brings the entire network down, through to leaving documents on a train, through to sending an innocuous email to the wrong person that's got personal information in it. So a data breach is really, really widely defined. And you do, in some situations, need to report. So there's kind of two reporting lines, really, that you need to bear in mind. One is to the ICO, so to the regulator in this sector, and one is to the affected individuals, who are sort of technically called, they're referred to as the data subjects. So where you need to report to the ICO, you need to do so without undue delay, and in any event within 72 hours of discovering the breach. That is a hard stop. That is something that you need to comply with. But crucially, you don't need to report the breach if there is no risk to the individuals involved. And what I mean by that is that their rights and freedoms are not going to be adversely affected by the breach. So you'd be looking at this, and this is ultimately a question of fact, and it's a real judgment call. So you would have, you need to consider things like who the affected individuals are, how much data is involved, what the nature of the information is. So if it's kind of sensitive, if it's health records, things like that. You need to consider who the recipient is. You need to consider whether or not it's confidential. All of those things are going to form a judgment as to whether or not you are going to need to report that breach. But if you send, for example, an innocuous email that contains someone else's information by accident, the likelihood is you're not going to need to report that breach. So it's not an absolute requirement. On the flip side, if you sent payroll records to the wrong person that had information about salary or had information about when someone was off sick, then you probably would need to consider reporting at that stage, but it's not an absolute requirement. On the flip side, you may also need to tell the affected individuals themselves. To do that, you need to just do it without undue delay. But crucially here, the bar is much higher. It's actually, you only need to report if there is a high risk to the individuals involved. So the bar is taken up, and that's for obvious reasons, because it's much more difficult, potentially, to go around and tell all of those affected individuals that there's been a data breach. That can take a lot of time, depending on how many people they're involved. It can be quite a big exercise. So really, you only need to tell affected individuals whose data has been breached in probably the more serious or the most serious of cases. So actually, the position under the GDPR is quite favourable. And if you get it wrong, then as we'll talk about in a moment, you're not necessarily going to be slapped with some massive fine. The likelihood is that the ICO will get in touch. They will ask you to give you reasons. They might ask you to sort of include sort of policies and procedures to make sure it doesn't happen again. So the second takeaway on that point is that not all data breaches need to be reported. So thirdly, I'm going to be talking about data protection officers. Again, this is a really a big area of confusion with the GDPR, and I think it's particularly relevant for local councils as well. So when I was doing a lot of these talks sort of in 2018, 2019, I'd often talk alongside someone who was sort of trying to sell data protection services. And as a result, what you found was that a load of organisations had data protection officers when they actually didn't need them. So the myth is very much that all organisations need a DPO. The reality is far different. Organisations only need a DPO in specific and quite limited circumstances. So a data protection officer only needs to be appointed if you're a public body or authority, and obviously that's going to be really relevant for those at this conference, so I'll come back to that shortly. 2, you need to appoint a data protection officer if you are using sensitive personal data on a large scale, which I suspect for most organisations is going to be pretty unlikely. You also need to appoint a data protection officer if you're monitoring areas on a large scale, so I don't know, CCTV in a large shopping centre or something like that, or monitoring online activity. But crucially, that bottom point there, which is that parish councils don't need to appoint a data protection officer unless they're using large-scale sensitive personal data or they're monitoring large-scale public areas. So that's really, and I did a bit of a straw poll before I wandered over to Scribe's offices, and I had a quick look to see how many parish councils had appointed data protection officers when they actually didn't need one, and the results were overwhelmingly high actually. There were quite a few that had appointed DPOs when they didn't need them. So if you're a parish councillor sat there and thinking, do you know what, it's made my life, it's given me a bit of a headache appointing a DPO, the reality is you actually don't need to. If you're a larger city or district council, then you would need to, because you'd fall under the grounds of 1. So, myth number 4 that we're going to get rid of here is that there's an absolute right to be forgotten. So, right to be forgotten was one of the big things that came in under the GDPR. It effectively means that an individual can get in touch and say, I'd like you to delete all of my information that you're holding on me. And there's, again, as with so many of these things that we've talked about so far, there is some real confusion. And what you had is organisations, even though they still needed the information, were just deleting it because they thought, oh no, we don't want to get fined by the ICO. There must be an absolute right. But that's not the case. Individuals only have the right to request that their information is deleted in specific situations, and quite limited situations. So as you can see throughout all of this, it's much more nuanced than these kind of absolute rights. Than, it's not necessarily absolute, not necessarily black and white. So individuals can only have their data deleted, firstly, where the information is actually not needed by your organisation. So if you still need that information, you're entitled to keep it. And if someone gets in touch with you to say, I want you to delete everything that you're holding on me, but you have a genuine reason for still holding on to it, then in most cases you can do exactly that. You can, individuals have the right to have their data deleted where consent was given, so the reason you're using it is because you've got their permission to use it to start with. Going back to what we first talked about, my view is that you should not really be collecting consent unless you absolutely need to. So get where you've got consent and then it's been subsequently withdrawn, then at that point that individual can ask you to delete everything that you're holding on them. Also, they can personal information can be deleted where it's needed to be deleted under some UK law, so health records, that sort of thing. But in most scenarios, what you'll find is that you don't need to comply with that. I mean, we get it at Leathes Prior all the time. We often get individuals who are doing a bit of a data cleanse turning around to us and saying, we'd like you to delete everything you're holding on us, and we want you to do it now. And we will always say, unfortunately, we can't, because we have a reason to keep that data. In our case, it's sort of anti-money laundering regulations and that sort of thing. But we have a reason to keep hold of it. So it's not an absolute right to be forgotten. And if you're getting a lot of people asking you to delete the information you hold on them, then you don't have to unless one of these grounds applies. And then finally, my last myth that we're going to dispel is in relation to fines. So this was the big sort of headline that came out from the GDPR back in May 2018. And the headline at the time was this: GDPR is all about the big fines. The ICO are after all small, medium-sized businesses, and they're going to whack them with these humongous fines. And that just simply isn't true. There have been very few fines issued by the ICO in the UK under the GDPR. The ICO can issue big fines. They do have the power to issue those big fines. As you'll see there, up to 4% of global turnover or 17.5 million, whichever is the greater. But there have been very few fines over the last 3.5 years. There's really only been, there's about 50 in total, and in the UK that is. And those fines have generally been fairly small, sometimes for kind of fairly sort of minor and technical things. So whilst the ICO has that ability to fine, they've made it very, very clear that that's not their intention, and actually they want to remedy some of these. They want people to remedy the issues first before going down the sanctions route. So that's everything from me on the myths, dispelling some of those key myths under the GDPR. Thanks very much for listening. As a final thought, I think the GDPR is, when it first came out, it was seen as very onerous. It was seen as a real sort of layer of compliance that a lot of organisations didn't need. But what we're finding more increasingly is that the GDPR, when you can navigate your way through that misinformation, what we're finding is that the GDPR in actual fact can be a really good way to help engage with local communities, or in businesses' case, engage with their customers and build up that trust by taking data protection seriously.